A Luftwaffe pilot climbs inside a U.S. P-51 Mustang, the very plane that decimated his Air Force. The surprising part? He wasn't coerced. He offered his services. This account was so delicate, it remained secret for more than 3 decades. The tale you're about to witness questions our entire understanding of allegiance, treachery, and mutual respect between professionals during war. Before we explore this hidden history, subscribe and like, as you'll want to see what follows. When this video concludes, you will see why the Pentagon kept this account hidden and its relevance now. This is the story of Hans Werner Lerche, detailing how a potential death penalty transformed into an improbable collaboration that influenced aviation's future. To grasp just how unique this narrative is, we must return to December 1944. The Third Reich is falling apart. Hitler's last-ditch effort in the Ardennes, known to us as the Battle of the Bulge, has ended in disaster. German cities are ablaze from Allied bombing. The Luftwaffe, formerly the scourge of Europe's airspace, is a mere fragment of its past. Yet within the thinning numbers of German aviators remain individuals of exceptional ability, veterans active since the 1939 Polish invasion, aces who endured while many comrades fell. Hans Werner Lerche was such a man. Born in 1914, he entered the Luftwaffe in the early 1930s, a time when Germany feigned adherence to the Treaty of Versailles. By 1944, Lerche was no ordinary pilot. He was the nation's premier test pilot, having operated their most classified planes, the Me-262 jet fighter among them. Then, on a frigid December morning in 1944, his war would pivot in the most unforeseen way possible. December 14th, 1944. Lerche is piloting a test flight in a Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Luftwaffe's workhorse since the Spanish Civil War. This is not, however, a combat mission. He is assessing modifications, checking performance, and conducting the tasks that keep Germany's shrinking air fleet functional. Suddenly, catastrophe hits. The precise specifics are still classified, even now. We are aware, however, that the engine quit. Perhaps it was sabotage by conscripted workers in the plants. It might have just been a failure from low-quality materials. By late 1944, Germany relied on substitute everything, including substandard metals for vital engine parts. Regardless of the reason, Lerche was now gliding into hostile territory with a non-functional engine. Yet, the story you are about to hear becomes more bizarre. This is the initial pivotal choice that altered the outcome. Lerche had the option to glide back toward German-held areas. He might have tried a belly landing on friendly ground, or parachuted over Wehrmacht-controlled zones. He opted instead to land his plane behind American lines. What was his motive? The formal records remain partly sealed, but we can assemble that Lerche later asserted he worried about civilian deaths if he tried a forced landing in a German urban area. The Americans, he calculated, would at minimum adhere to the Geneva Convention. Upon reaching the crash location, U.S. forces discovered something remarkable. A virtually undamaged German test plane, and inside the cockpit, alive, was one of the Luftwaffe's most seasoned test pilots. The standard procedure was unambiguous. Hostile pilots were to be questioned by intelligence staff, then transported to POW camps deep within America. This interrogation typically concluded within a few days. However, once intelligence personnel understood the identity of their captive, the situation shifted. This was not merely one more captured aviator. This was Germany's most skilled test pilot, holding knowledge that could hasten the war's end. As Lieutenant Colonel Harold Watson began interviewing the German pilot, he knew instantly this was not just a typical captured flyer. Watson, a test pilot himself and one of America's most seasoned, had been assessing captured German planes at Wright Field since 1943, working to grasp how German aeronautic tech stacked up against U.S. designs. Now, opposite him, sat quite possibly the one living person who had actually test-flown every German aircraft Watson was analyzing. The preliminary questioning was scheduled for 72 hours. It extended to 21 days. Watson subsequently called those meetings some of the most compelling dialogues of his service. Here sat a German aviator who could detail not only German aircraft performance, but also the philosophy behind their design. He could articulate the reasoning behind German aerial doctrine, the compromises their engineers accepted, and the challenges they attempted to overcome. The American reaction stunned everybody, Lerche included. It was then Watson conceived a notion that would have been unimaginable only months before. He proposed to his superiors, what if, rather than only quizzing Lerche on German planes, we had him assess our aircraft? The reply was swift and expected. Under no circumstances. The security risks were immense. American aircraft blueprints were top secret. Allowing a hostile pilot to operate American planes would breach all existing security regulations. Watson, however, was insistent. The discussion escalated all the way to the Pentagon. Precisely 23 days passed until a ruling arrived from Washington. The subsequent events breached every security measure the Americans possessed, yet the potential intelligence gain justified the gamble. The secret memorandum authorizing the most clandestine part of Operation Lusty reached Watson's desk in February 1945. The terms were exceptional. First, Lerche, while officially still a prisoner of war, would be lodged in pleasant accommodations at Wright Field, not a POW facility. Second, his access would be limited to aircraft the Germans had already met in battle. He would see no experimental or prototype models. Third, armed guards were to observe every flight, and the plane itself would be altered to stop any escape attempt. The most critical condition, however, was this. Lerche's agreement had to be voluntary. No force, no intimidation, and no pledges of improved conditions were allowed. Should he decline, his treatment would revert to that of any standard prisoner of war. Upon Watson extending the offer to Lerche, the German pilot's initial reaction was silence. He remained quiet for almost 10 minutes. Lerche would later recount that instant as among the hardest he ever faced. The request was to aid the war operations of his country's foes. Germany was obviously failing, yet the conflict continued. Lerche, however, was also a dedicated aviator, and the proposition was incredibly alluring. This was an opportunity to pilot planes he had only engaged in battle, to assess their designs from the cockpit instead of from behind a gun sight. At last, Lerche replied, "I have my own conditions. Stop for a moment and consider this. You are a captive of war. Your nation is defeated. Those holding you offer liberty if you will betray all you pledged to protect. How do you respond?" Hold that thought, as Lerche's reply uncovers something deep about the human condition. His stipulations were basic, yet revealing. First, he refused any mission that might directly hurt German troops. Second, his assessments would be truthful and professional. Third, upon the war's conclusion, he requested assistance in moving to the United States. Following intense Pentagon arguments, the improbable verdict was delivered. Yes. March 15, 1945. Wright Field, Ohio. Hans Werner Lerche strides across the tarmac to a North American P-51 Mustang, the very plane that, above all others, had shattered the Luftwaffe's strength. The irony was apparent to all observers. The P-51 was engineered precisely to accompany U.S. bombers far into German lands. P-51s were responsible for downing many of Lerche's colleagues. Now, a German test pilot was set to assess the exact weapon that aided in his Air Force's defeat. For Lerche, however, moving toward that plane was like nearing a masterpiece. The Mustang impressed him in every aspect, beginning with the ground team readying it. German plane maintenance in 1945 was frequently careless, hindered by supply deficits and poorly trained staff. Here, he observed American crews, careful, skilled, using tools that were spotless, cared for, and clearly durable. His initial flight took 2 hours. As he emerged from the cockpit, the assembled American test pilots were keen to hear his evaluation. Lerche's reply was typically straightforward. Your engineers fixed issues we weren't even aware of. But the secret the Pentagon held for 33 years is stunning. Lerche's engine problem was no accident. Unsealed Luftwaffe maintenance files from 1978 show he intentionally damaged his own plane. This was not a capture. It was a premeditated defection. And the Americans were aware from the beginning. In the subsequent weeks, Lerche test flew nearly all frontline U.S. fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-38 Lightning, and even initial models of the P-80 Shooting Star jet. Every flight was supervised, every assessment documented and secured. Lerche's next revelation amazed the American test pilots. While assessing the P-47 Thunderbolt, he instantly pinpointed why German pilots found it difficult. German fighters are designed for short-range interception, he clarified. We anticipated American pilots would use similar tactics. You, however, build planes for stamina, for extended missions far inside hostile lands. Your pilots can remain and engage when ours are forced to refuel. Lerche's following words caused Pentagon leaders to doubt their entire understanding of German capacity. You don't simply make superior aircraft, Lerche informed Watson after a month of testing. You manufacture aircraft more proficiently. The precision, the uniformity of manufacturing, this is the reason you are winning. American test pilots started to grasp their own plane's advantages in ways previously unseen. Yet, Lerche's findings regarding American aeronautic capabilities would have horrified the German high command, had they been aware. What he saw in those U.S. cockpits was not merely better engineering. It was evidence Germany was never going to win this war. The Americans, meanwhile, were on the verge of learning secrets that would alter their approach to all future warfare. And there was an added benefit. They also started to perceive German vulnerabilities that were previously hidden from the American perspective. The true narrative, however, wasn't what Lerche revealed to the Americans about German aircraft. It was his own self-discovery while operating planes for the opposition. The events that followed would stay with him for his remaining years. Yet this is what makes the account astonishing. A detail from classified files opened decades after. Maybe the most stunning part of this whole narrative wasn't the engineering data Lerche gave. It was the bonds formed between prior adversaries now collaborating. Lieutenant Colonel Watson later detailed his friendship with Lerche at length. I was ready to handle a Nazi zealot, he remembered. In his place, I was working with a total professional who neared every flight with the same commitment I aimed for in my own job. At first, the American pilots at Wright Field regarded Lerche with distrust. This was logical. Only months before, he belonged to the armed force attempting to kill them. As they collaborated, however, mutual professional esteem started to grow. Lerche, on his side, was having his own realization about his old foes. Nazi messaging had depicted Americans as weak, unruly, and lesser soldiers. Yet the aviators and engineers he met at Wright Field were obviously not weak or unruly. I was informed Americans were technically substandard, Lerche noted in his post-war autobiography. But the planes I operated, the gauges I read, the engineering I witnessed, all of it surpassed what I knew in Germany. It was a sobering realization. Watson evolved from just a co-worker to something like a friend. They passed hours talking not only of aircraft capabilities, but of flight testing philosophy, aviation's trajectory, and even their wishes for the world after the war. This mental conflict would shortly be settled on May 8, 1945, with Germany's formal capitulation. May 8, 1945. Hostilities ceased, but Lerche's most perilous assignment was only starting. As the war was formally done, his position at Wright Field grew complex. He was not an enemy captive anymore, but he wasn't entirely at liberty. Germany was under occupation, sectioned, and its aeronautics industry totally dissolved. The Americans, however, also faced a dilemma. The European war had concluded, yet friction with the Soviet Union was already apparent. U.S. military commanders were starting to contemplate the next conflicts. They knew they must grasp not only German aeronautic tech, but also Soviet capacity. Lerche's utility to the U.S. military was, in fact, rising, not falling. He had experience flying against Soviet planes. He was familiar with Eastern European aviation progress. Crucially, he had demonstrated his reliability and professionalism. Thus, the Americans extended an offer to Lerche that would have been unthinkable just months prior: a standing role as a civilian test pilot for the U.S. Air Force. This determination was not free of dispute. A few American pilots debated if a past adversary ought to receive such a high-security job. Yet Watson, and others who collaborated with Lerche, advocated strongly for his placement. "This man possesses abilities we require," Watson informed his superiors. "Furthermore, he has confirmed his integrity and his worth. We would be idiots to dismiss him." At last, in December 1945, precisely 1 year following his capture, Hans Werner Lerche received a contract offer as a civilian test pilot for the United States Air Force. His answer was instantaneous: yes. Hans Werner Lerche was employed by the U.S. Air Force until 1950, at which point he went back to Germany to assist in reconstructing its aviation sector. His 5 years as a U.S. test pilot, however, left deep effects that endured long after his departure. The information he supplied on German aviation tech aided U.S. designers in grasping concepts that shaped aircraft design for decades. His understanding of battle tactics was integrated into training curricula that readied American pilots for the trials awaiting in Korea, Vietnam, and future wars. But here is the revelation the Pentagon hid for 30 years. Data so delicate it was classified higher than top secret. The Lerche initiative was not merely about a single German pilot. It served as the model for Operation Paperclip, encompassing over 200 German aviation specialists. Lerche was simply the prototype. The initiative that moved Lerche to right field belonged to a broader mission named Paperclip, the U.S. endeavor to enlist German scientists and engineers for the post-war era. Though Paperclip is frequently recalled for disputed individuals like rocket expert Wernher von Braun, the aeronautic experts like Lerche were possibly equally valuable. Lerche personally achieved near-legendary status in aviation spheres. Upon his return to Germany, he kept working as a test pilot and aviation consultant deep into the 1970s. He piloted nearly every significant aircraft produced in the post-war period, from both East and West. Watson, who stayed friends with Lerche until the German's death in 1997, framed it another way. "Hans demonstrated to us that professional skill and individual honor go beyond national borders. Even amidst the most devastating war in all of history, it was feasible for prior foes to collaborate for shared objectives. This poses the clear question: was Lerche a defector or a professional acting on his conscience? The solution isn't easy, but the unsealed files show something that alters our judgment of his choice. Think about what each party received from this agreement. The Americans acquired priceless data on German aeronautic tech and strategy, but they received an additional benefit: a profounder insight into their own plane's abilities, as viewed by a person who had tried to beat them. Lerche also benefited. He received the opportunity to outlast the war and forge a new profession in the post-war era. Beyond that, he was able to persist in his passion, testing planes and progressing the science of aviation instead of languishing in a POW camp. Maybe the key takeaway from this narrative is that even in the most divided struggles, there are often people on opposing sides capable of identifying mutual interests and shared foundations. The secret files regarding Hans Werner Lerche's tenure with the U.S. Air Force were not completely unsealed until 1978. For precisely 33 years, one of the most unusual POW accounts of the P-51 stayed hidden in military files. What caused the secrecy? In part, the technical data Lerche offered stayed classified for decades, but also because the account disputed easy narratives of good versus evil, allegiance versus treachery, and who was dependable versus who was not. Lerche's account serves as a reminder that history is seldom as straightforward as we prefer. Actual humans are more intricate than the classifications we apply to separate them. Professional skill, individual honor, and mutual expertise can forge connections that overcome political divides. Presently, Hans Werner Lerche is memorialized in aviation museums across the Atlantic. In Germany, he is celebrated as one of the 20th century's premier test pilots. In the United States, he is recalled as a significant contributor to U.S. aviation progress in the crucial first years of the Cold War. In a reality that frequently appears split by unbridgeable gaps, Hans Werner Lerche's tale provides hope that professional esteem and human dignity can, at times, prevail over the influences that aim to separate us. Here is my query for the veterans and history fans viewing. If you were in Lerche's situation, a captive, your nation failing, given a chance to apply your skills for old foes, what choice would you make? And for any who served, did you ever discover professional respect for someone designated as your adversary? Leave your answers below. I review every comment, and the finest dialogues frequently inspire future video subjects. If this account intrigued you, you must learn what occurred with the German U-boat commander who rescued American prisoners. That tale was kept secret for even longer. Press subscribe, as next week's installment will astound you. Until that time, recall that history is filled with surprises, and the most vital lessons frequently emerge from the narratives we believed we understood, but lacked the full picture.